Welcome to the Theology Pugcast. I'm C.R. Wiley, and I'm joined by a couple of guys that I'm usually with when we do these shows, and I'll let them introduce themselves, but I'm a pastor in the Pacific Northwest. I've written a number of things, write a lot of stuff for World Magazine, particularly their op-ed page online, and I'm also a senior editor for Touchstone Magazine. Enough about me. So how about you, Glenn?
I'm Glenn Sunshine. I'm a retired history professor specializing in Renaissance and Reformation Europe. I'm a ministry associate at Reflections Ministries working on curriculum development and content. And I'm a senior fellow at the Colson Center for Christian Worldview. And I have my own ministry, Every Square Inch Ministries. And that keeps me off the streets.
Yeah, it keeps you busy. Anyway, that's what retirement is like. You know, you go from 40 hours a week to 80 hours a week.
All right.
All right, Tom, why don't you introduce yourself and then tell us what we're talking about today?
Okay, I'm not retired, but I'm matching schedules pretty much one for one. got something burning in a lot of ovens. Well, one of the topics the topic tip for today is one of the ones that is coming out of what I'm working on, the long promised kind of handbook for the baptized. And one of the things I've been reflecting on is how constructively to think about as Christians that part of our baptism that is a renunciation of Satan and an assault on the idolatrous order that we're called to go to battle with in the name of the victory of Christ. I mean, this is sort of what sets it.
Yeah, now this is something that maybe we should fill people in on. So traditionally, you know, when you in baptism, for an adult anyway, there would be a renunciation of the world, the flesh, and the devil. I don't think that many traditions still carry that forward, at least in Protestantism.
Yeah.
Well, and actually, even with infant baptism, I don't know how long this lasted, but they used to do an exorcism.
Yeah,
baptism.
Didn't they do that in the Eastern Church primarily?
I think it was also in the Western, certainly in the Eastern, but I think the Western Church did it at least for a while as well.
Okay.
Yeah, we still have it as part of our liturgy in our church, and I think it's an important one. We also have it as part of when you're confirmed, so it's part of both. But I think fundamentally, it's biblical all the way down in the sense that when you convert to Christ's lordship, you are part now of his kingdom of light and his victory over the gods and the demons, death, hell, and the grave. And so part of what we do as his ambassadors, if you will, is carry out that battle of bringing all things into conformity to Christ, first and foremost our own lives in our commitment to the church and its mission, but also, as the church did from the start, as it goes out in mission, is proclaim the victory of Christ. And that has definitely both a spiritual and a, concomitant moral aspect to it. And it did from the start. And so one of the things that you see early on in Christianity is the way in which the Christian distinct understanding of God, creation, redemption starts to foreshadow itself in different places. I'll give you a good example. St. Augustine, talking, of course, to his generation, was basically creating a defense against charges against Christians that they basically were responsible for being bad citizens, right, of Rome, and that helped prepare the way for a weakness and then its own sack, right? And one of the things that Augustine noted was, first and foremost, that what the Romans tended to do is brag a lot about how glorious their past was and how noble and virtuous they were, and really do this in utter ignorance of their own often rigorous depravity, corruption, and vice, which always handicapped a lot of its better virtues. So he would admit it had a lot of good virtues, but this was always limited. And he pressed on it. A lot of it had to do with their religion, because their religion basically isn't the true God, but is demonic at root. And that demonic allowed for that corruption to be expressed in all kinds of social ways, theaters, spectacles. We'll get into some of this. But one of the things he noted is that during the invasion, where the Visigoths are basically coming in, Alaric, I guess, is the figure I'm
Right.
thinking in particular. One of the things that happened is there was such a renowned respect for churches because of the name of Christ and the distinction it brought to culture, that the Visigoths stopped and allowed churches to become sanctuaries for Romans who were caught up in the battle and would not be captured if they got to the church, and they would not be raided or become slaves. They allowed it to be a sanctuary, if you will. Now, this is totally different, though it maybe gets a little bit of its semblance from in sanctuary cities today, though those are run off of different theological steam. But what it provided for Augustine is a foreshadowing of the Christian difference. That here is someone who is considered by Romans as a barbaric, and he was barbaric. But even this one would stop at the recognition of this Christian difference brought into the world. There was something about Christ and what the church was committed to that made him take a step back and allow it to become a haven of peace, even for people that didn't convert. Pagan Romans, they were allowed to go in.
Yeah, one thing you have to remember is that the Visigoths at this point were sort of Christians. Mm-hmm. They were Arians.
Yeah.
So what's interesting is that even as Arians, they honored the Orthodox churches.
Yes. Yeah.
So we can't forget that. They're not just barbarians. You do have a Christian influence.
And Arian Christianity was spreading at that time in influence. But one of the things they allowed for pagans to basically go there, and the church didn't demand conversion, allowed them to take safe haven there. So after these pagans were let go and allowed to live and go on with their lives, right? They were the very voices in many cases that were charging the church with being the very weakening of Rome. And this is where Augustine goes after the ingratitude of those who take for granted that this something special is not something from the Roman gods or the Roman virtue, but distinctly Christian, and a distinctly contribution that saved their very lives, and if not, their own continuance as Romans. And yet here they are. This was a very vehicle, in a sense, of some kind of salvation for them, and yet all they had was ingratitude and basically a criticism of the church. Now, of course, there's a lot there, because we could say very much that even though the Enlightenment may be a disfiguring of a lot of what Christianity gave, it still carries a lot of its riches around with it. And the benefits that we have today that have come from Christianity, rather than the barbaric world that preceded it, is such that we too are often ungrateful and think if we could just dismantle the impact of Christianity in the world, we're going to create a utopia of freedom and equity, rather than a barbaric situation that is so horrendous that we don't even have an imagination for it.
Yeah, one of the things too that is a problem for us is there's a kind of the residue of a Christian civilization still with us, but there's tremendous ignorance about Christianity, generally speaking.
Yeah.
So there'll be a few things that people will recall or will use as a basis for their contempt for the faith. A classic example would be maybe the Crusades, which are not understood and are misrepresented, even when people, know a little bit about them. But, so, and one of the things that troubles me is that we lack the kind of, I guess, confidence, even as the church, to correct these people.
Yeah.
Most of the time we just say, so we're so sorry we're guilty of sinning. Well, yes, I mean, we should be able to say that when in fact we are guilty, but we shouldn't just take our accuser's word, the word for it, with regard to everything.
Well, one of the things, I think you're exactly right, Chris. I think that, this old claim that still lingers in the nodding heads of the babbling elite, that whenever somebody comes up with, oh, well, monotheism has contributed to more world violence, than anything in history. It is firstly ignorant. The vast majority of history's wars were in the service of, quote unquote, the many gods, or
no
one
God.
among those many.
Or no God.
Or
Right.
no God.
Yeah, well, that's right. Well, that's where we're getting, or territory, national and racial kind of, purity, conquest of power, all libido dominandi, which are contrary to the Christian vision and were compromises that Christianity had to make as a larger influence on a society. But tribal supremacy, that wants to come back. Empire, the greater good. How much has been killed in the name of the greater good? Ideologies, and of course atheism probably spilt more blood, and of course they want to kind of move away from that and act like that wasn't in their hand. But the ethics of compassion that Christianity brought, and the relational changes to society, we cannot fathom. I think. I mean, we're getting a little taste. Those of us old enough to have lived maybe, for a couple of generations, to start seeing the impact of more and more Christian influence shed in society. Some of like the vulgar pride parades and, all of the kind of bacchanalian, dances that are going on in a lot of these kind of cultural, theatrical, plays, if you will. But we don't have a taste yet for the barbarism that very well could be around the corner. I think Nietzsche, of all figures, because he understood how historically contingent virtues and values are in the way in which Christianity came and disrupted that ancient order, knew that once God was erased and in the traces of God, that you better look out for what's coming.
Right. Yeah, I think with regard to this kind of neo-paganism that we're experiencing, the thing that disturbs me is that it seems, in a certain sense, worse than the paganism of the past. I think C.S. Lewis says something to that effect. That if it were just that old paganism,
yeah, that's right.
We might see something different sort of come about. But the challenge that we face now has to do with a kind of I think chronological snobbery, as Lewis described it. That because Christianity is something in the rearview mirror for many people, therefore it must be moribund, or it failed, or something like that.
Yeah.
As a historian, I would say that we're really in uncharted territory right now. We've never been in a situation where we have a post-Christian society.
Right.
Yeah. It's one thing to be in a pagan society, bring Christianity in, grow the church. It's another thing to be in a society that feels like it's been there, done that. Christianity has nothing at all to offer. It's a very different situation to try to build the church, spread the gospel, all of that in that kind of setting. And frankly, like I said, we're called to do it, so we do it. But in terms of the historical context, we're in uncharted territory now.
Yeah,
Right.
I think you're right on the money there. I think one of the things I've been trying to communicate different times is something very similar, is that what we're dealing with is something that carries along with it, as we mentioned before, kind of Christian truths gone mad as well. And one of the things I think, because of the Christian influence of its conception of God and the human made in the image of God, and when those alterations happened centuries back, but they filtered down through Christianity and its influence on society, there became something about the human being as an image bearer of God, whose will is significant, that when ripped from that theological context and becomes almost a God of itself, right? My self-choosing and self-determining reality, right? Myself as, the final goal of everything. That becomes a harder God to attack because it's me. And so I don't see it as a god. I don't see it as an idol. And this is one of the things I was really going on the topic of the show, which I haven't even gotten to, by the way. But I took this title from Professor Cobb, who wrote a book for I think the Blackwell Theology series on popular culture, and it's a pretty fascinating, kind of Tillichian interpretation of these things. But he does have a lot of insight. But he has a great title called "The Congenital Defects of Popular Culture." And I think one of the things that very point we're talking about, Glenn, is the changed situation, is that a lot of the things that were Christian gifts to the West, the significance of the human, each human being as an image bearer, the cultural significance that we should give to allowing people to pursue, the good, and the like, a certain notion of freedom. Those were gifts, but when they are ripped from that theological and recentered in a certain conception of the human being and a certain conception of the will, they become very destructive. They become kind of ends in their own way, if you will, power for itself, power, empowerment for its own sake, or for my own libido dominante, my own lust for dominance, or my own lust to be glorified. So we actually go back to, even though we're in uncharted territory, we're also in familiar territory, because this was kind of the sin world that someone like Augustine was confronting when he was talking to the Romans in the city of God. Those two value systems of self-glory, right, and the glory of Rome, fame for its own sake, self-recognition, self-exaltation, and then the reason or the ultimate goal is to increase one's power and dominance, to dominate. And the whole society fostered this ethic. And in a sense, you see something of a return to that, or at least taking off a lot of Christian limits, and that's running around. But one of the things I wanted to talk about is the way in which a couple of figures in the early church dealt with one of the ways in which that kind of value system, the self-glory, and lust for dominance, and other vices, became promoted by the various aspects of culture, because that was sort of how the culture saw itself and what it valued. So Tertullian, we remember that figure from the early church, 160, 225 AD. He was, I think, located on the north coast of Africa. And we know him kind of as, a lot of people tend to think of him as an early presuppositionalist. I'll take issue with that. I don't even think we really fathom what he meant with, Athens. What does basically Jerusalem have to do with Athens? But I don't think he was on to what most people think he was on to. He was a very talented lawyer and applied very rigorous legal reasoning in his apologetic. That would be unfamiliar to a lot of folks. But anyway, one of the things he did is he was a very strong moralist in his understanding of Christianity, because the society was so corrupt. And one of the books he wrote was really, I think, one of the first criticisms of kind of practices of entertainment and public game and celebration, basically symbolic enactments in culture that kind of basically project what is valuable to that culture, but also foster and shape that culture in that continued image. And these were called spectacles. Glenn, you probably have quite a bit to say on these, but I think we could get a glimpse of what one of the types of spectacles was: the gladiatorial games. This is the one he goes after in particular. And they were exceptionally brutal. Basically, a wealthy person could purchase someone that was in jail or doing some time, and could, basically fund to have that person enter these games for public spectacle, and basically prove their strength and, ability, and continue life or get some kind of benefits by continuously winning. And they could become famous in their own level, if you will. I don't know that they ever got freed, but they at least were able to do it, but they were often going to battle to kill another person freed from jail just to enter that game and basically meet their death. This is how they often got rid of kind of enemies, you cleaned their jails out and did other things. So this was a blood sport, but this was a blood sport that the society drank and thirsted for. And this was similar to, you had theater, of course, where you had a lot of theater wasn't just kind of going to see an R-rated movie with a little bit of nudity. It was often very vile. There could be real rapes happening on sets. I mean, public entertainment, which people were very involved in, and it basically reiterated what Augustine later will say, the corrupt nature of the gods, the demons that are influencing the society.
Yeah, so, I think something to think a little bit about is the success of the church in the early centuries, I think, had to do in part with the kind of a revulsion that particularly people who were harmed by these things felt. And so the call to to turn away from these things, to renounce these things, I think we've lost our ability to understand how the ascetic practices of the church were appealing. They weren't a turnoff. Now, today, when people think about them, they think about maybe the abuses of the Middle Ages or something. And I'm not an authority on that subject, and maybe I'm misrepresenting it, but that's the popular way of thinking about it. I wonder if our future as the church might not entail a recovery of these ascetic practices, just basic stuff like fasting. Because there's a sense in which I think sometimes there's such a sort of almost dunderheaded rejection of Gnosticism that people think that anything that smacks of an ascetic is somehow a real hatred for creation itself, rather than a renunciation of the enslavement to the flesh that people want to be freed from, and the culture that encourages it. Right.
I recently put up a video on my website talking about the history of Lent. This is a good time to be talking about this kind of thing and the practices that were associated with it. And really, Jesus seems to assume we're going to fast.
Right.
However you want to set that up, whatever you want to think about that in connection with regulative principle or anything else, fasting is a practice we ought to be engaged in. Mm-hmm. If we're going to do what Jesus did, getting alone, right, solitude, silence, these kinds of things, also ascetic practices, are things we ought to be thinking about, because Jesus did it. And if he needed it, it might be a good idea for us.
Yeah,
there's a lot to be said for those.
Yeah, I came across something here the other day that Aaron Wrenn shared through his Substack, which I thought was significant. And I went to read the original piece, which was a different Substack. That's a whole world in itself, by the way. If you, it's like a rabbit hole. You could just kind of go and go and go. But anyway, this guy, I can't remember the name of the guy or the name of the Substack. I'm sorry. I'll try to find it and put it in the show notes. But his point was, with AI, we are on the verge of a new kind of pornography, which is a custom-made AI-generated pornography that's going to be very realistic. It already is, and doesn't need people. So his point is that one of the main ways that we've been able to, as Christians, sort of mount an attack on pornography and get secular people to join with us in the work of resisting pornographic influences, or the porn industry, is we can talk about exploitation. We can say, well, think about all these girls who are being taken advantage of. Shouldn't we, not objectify women? Well, this deals with that. Yeah. So now, since there are no real women involved in the pornography. We can't say that anymore. So what are we going to say? Does that make pornography okay? Or do we have to say this damages us spiritually? And there is no way for us to sort of just say that there's some broadly, sort of appealing kind of thing that we can state that is also a problem.
Yeah,
we've been kind of hiding, the renunciation of the flesh under sort of the political correctness of freeing people, liberating people from oppression. But that's going away.
Yeah.
There's a story that Augustine tells. I think it's in the Confessions, about a guy who's a Christian. He knew that gladiatorial games were bad news, but somebody invited him to go. And he went along and he watched the games, and he quickly became addicted and kept going back and going back and going back. And it seems to me that there is that's something worth pondering.
Yeah.
As we are looking at what, I'm not going back to the fundamentalists. Don't go to movies, don't watch TV, don't get on the internet. I'm not going there. But there's something to be said about being really careful what you ingest in terms of media or entertainment, with the recognition that even a single exposure could end up having really serious consequences long term. It could lead to this kind of addiction.
Yeah, related to that, I know you want to move on, Tom, but
no, it's okay. It's fine. We got time. We got time.
but related to that, anyone who's actually engaged in a fast, a food, but also a fast maybe from media, can testify to the kind of cleansing sort of a sense that one experiences when you do that. There's a sense in which you're almost kind of being reset. Because there is a kind of, I don't know, a sense of kind of being, sort of submerged in the flesh. And when I'm referring to the flesh, I'm thinking about the passions that are unredeemed. I'm talking the excesses. I'm not talking about the simple pleasures that we enjoy because we're embodied creatures. I'm talking about what I think the flesh is actually referring to in the New Testament is this sort of the substitution of physical pleasures for a higher calling.
Yeah.
That's the thing. It's the substitution, and it's the submersion of to the point of spiritual death in this that I think that the ascetic practices help to free us from.
That's right. I think ascetic practices understood biblically, and that's what we're talking about here, not as ways of kind of meriting certain favor, but as participations in the putting off of the old and putting on the new. I mean, what does Jesus tell us? Because now you are, who you are is now grounded in eternity. Put off the old, put on the new. There's nothing but ascetic practices tied to that. You who were angry doing this, do this no more. All these different aspects of the flesh that were, that played upon our appetites and desires are now to be purified. And this is not contributing to the work of Christ. This is actually participating in its benefits, right? This is where I think people often go wrong. They think if you do anything with your agency spiritually, somehow it's not God doing it. And no, this is the glorious freedom of the children of God. And so this is the higher state we're called to, is to bring all things, our desires in particular, and our bodily, in our body and in its passions into orientation to Christ. And there is a cultural difference that shows up amongst the social pathologies and the spiritual perversions that we see all around us. And this is, I think, one of the things we're hinting on. If the church didn't, in some ways, however imperfectly, foreshadow that Christian difference, then the impact of the church clearly would never be what it has been. And I think I'm going to get back to some of the ways in which that complicates our current situation, but we are back at this point. And hold on to this notion of what do we do, because I think those are some of the questions that I'm probing. So one of the things early on Tertullian was worried about, Augustine too, is the spectacles, especially of combat, but all the others basically led to spiritual problems, right? Agitation, appetites and desires directed towards destructive, chaotic, and demonic things. And so you have a whole culture that becomes shaped by that, and the social pathologies that come from that are huge. So there is social problems that are enslaving and destructive that these participating in these things continues to cultivate and shape. And so, and one of the things that Tertullian does, interestingly, is he lists, because they listed all the different gods that those different kinds of basically all of those games and all of those theater and all that celebrated. One was, of course, Venus, right? The goddess of lust, right? So lust was one. The bacchanalian, right? Drunkenness, partying, till you drop out. All of these things that we start to see again celebrated at big events like Super Bowl, right? I'm going to get there. I want to get there because I think the discernment of these early church ministers, if you will, is such that we can learn a lot, even if we can't run the same way they did because our context is somewhat different. But
This reminds me of a couple of things. One is when I lived in Cambridge, I lived right down the street from a grocery store called Bread and Circus. And it was kind of an upscale, crunchy kind of thing where you could pay, $30 for a 7-grain loaf of bread or something like that. Is that kind of thing. The other thing that got me thinking about is Pompeii and this scroll that has recently been read using artificial intelligence. It was a remarkable sort of, and I think, redeeming use of that technology. So I'm not a big fan of AI, but in this particular case, it was
it solved
it solved the problem. But did you guys see the reports on what was in the scroll?
I didn't.
Epicurean. I saw that they read it, but that's it.
Epicurean philosophy.
Oh, really?
Yeah. So this was from a library of a wealthy resident of Pompeii. What would you expect in his library? Life of Anthony? No, it was the celebration of pleasure.
Yeah.
Reflections on pleasure by an Epicurean philosopher.
Wow. Yeah.
And of course, Mount Vesuvius erupts and wipes the place out like straight out of the Bible.
Yeah.
Well, and actually, if you look at the artifacts at Pompeii, a lot of them are downright pornographic, up to and including oil lamps.
Yeah.
One of my former students was there with his junior high, I think it was, age son, and they were going through and they took him to the brothel. And there were across the, because people couldn't read, there were across the top depictions of everything you could get done there and how much it cost. And this poor, 13-year-old or whatever he was just horribly embarrassed by this whole thing. But I can understand that.
And the father was probably thinking, here I'm giving my son a great cultural experience.
Well, I don't think his father quite expected that.
Right.
It's interesting. I was in Ostia, Italy, which is where I think the famous episode of Monica St. Augustine's mother's, the famous story about her praying there. But I also think it was where Pasolini, the gay filmmaker, was murdered in a prostitution act. I don't know. It's one of these mixed places. But they you have all your mosaics there, but you have several buildings right in the middle of it. And they're cut off for the most part, but you can peek in the window, but they're the same. They're all these pornographic images, which were basically the regular, meeting house of the locals. And it's interesting. We went around one corner. I was with some friends, and there was a mass being done outside in the middle of it, basically trying to still negate all of it.
Right,
all
right,
of its
right.
history. And yeah, it's interesting. But this was the world in which, a lot of these Christians had to figure out, what does it mean to enact a Christian difference? How do I still be a citizen, all the while being a resident alien, and part of an eternal city? I don't just, I don't do like we would do today in a lot of the evangelical churches, just try to find a way for Christianity to be palatable to that barbaric and perverse world. Sorry. There is a clear Christian distinction based on the distinct nature of God, creation, and what we're called to, that leaves that out of the question for these early Christians. And
Yeah,
the fact that they can see the difference between their God and this is powerful.
right. Just a side note here, theater in this period was frankly pornographic,
Yeah.
overwhelmingly.
Yeah.
So when the early church fathers are denouncing theater, that's what they've got in mind. The unfortunate side effect of this, I strongly suspect, is that when you get to the Puritans, these guys knew the church fathers.
Yeah.
And so they pick up their rhetoric against theater, even the theater that isn't pornographic.
Yeah.
And that, I suspect, is why they're down on a lot of what's going on in Elizabethan England.
Yeah. That is fascinating in its own way. And I think this is the way in which kind of fundamentalisms develop.
Right.
They don't recognize how radically the church has impacted the world. So all they can see is, how do we make it more pure? And the best way to do it is just condemn things that already, for the most part, had weaned those things off of the former gods and practices, and actually put a Christian stamp of influence on them, changed them. And this is one of the things that I'm kind of get, because you think of old games, like, not just the gladiatorial games, but games themselves, the Olympics for that matter, which when Christianity came on the scene, they eventually stamped out, put an end to it. And why? Well, because it wasn't just because they didn't appreciate sport. It was that sport was so wedded to spiritual perversion and all of the symbolic aspects of their commitment to a culture given over to the demonic, that there was no way to have something like a secularized sport. These things were all part of the continuance of the religious symbolism that kept propagating these spiritual, problems and social pathologies. And so it was a long time, but in the process, as Christianity makes an impact on culture, you begin to see real changes happen that even non-Christians begin benefiting from and participating in things that were given by the church that society didn't have before. I'll give you another example. When you were having the back and forths in Rome, you eventually had Julian the Apostate, who wanted to return to an old pagan and get rid of the increasing Christian influence. But he has been so Christianized indirectly by the changes in culture that a lot of what he wants to create in a society were owed to Christianity, not to the old pagan past. So in a sense, you could say he was acting more as a Christian than a pagan, even though he was wanting to make Rome, pagan again, if you will.
Yeah.
And so this is how powerful the Christian impact is. I mean, you see this in hospitals and healthcare, care for the poor. I mean, you see transforming dimensions to society that we take for granted. Now, let's kind of jump from there to now. And it was interesting because I didn't watch the Super Bowl recently, and I'm not here to condemn people who enjoy watching football. One of the things I would say is sport has radically changed. We're not watching football to watch the barbaric games of old, though some people will still think it is. We're not watching gladiatorial sport and bloodbath, right? It may still be a lot of, physical, back and forth, but on the whole, it's removed from that. And of course, the overt commitment to any pagan gods or, the demonic, if you will. It is very much immersed in a lot of the kind of post-Enlightenment, Enlightenment values and their impact on society. And some of these are very Christian, right? Teamwork, working together, a certain kind of solidarity, and identity with teams that helps, one kind of build a unity in a society rather than just fighting each other. There's a lot of good things, just like Rome could have a lot of good things. But still, if we kind of unpack it a little bit, these things, sport, can become a kind of symbol in society, especially as significant as it is for a lot of people in American culture, that has a lot of influence. It has a lot of indirect impact on people who, follow it the whole season, have athletes they want to emulate and the like, whatever. But some athletes, of course, may do it very much for the libido dominandi, right? The fame, the fortune they get out of it, how they can be the center of, a lot of money thrown at them and their name on everything and, personal self-glory, right? But it could also be something that someone actually loves and does in humility, right? You can have someone who just wants to they're good at it, they want to do it, so they don't have to be given over to it as an idol, right? It doesn't have to become something we say, oh, sport is all bad, can't do it.
It reminds me, of Chariots of Fire.
Yeah.
Which is really an extended reflection on this very thing.
Mm-hmm.
If folks haven't had a chance to see that, I think, we take it for granted because, it was something that was part of the larger culture when we were younger. I wonder how many people born since, say, 1995 are even aware of it.
Yeah.
Ever watched it. But in that film, here we have a very early Olympic Games that is in Paris, and so there's a kind of Christian appropriation of that formerly pagan celebration, and there's a lot of very serious reflection on sports in the course of the film, because one of the characters, of course, is Eric Liddell, who's a son of missionaries and a great runner, and he's faced with a choice. There's a crisis of conscience. Being a good Sabbatarian, he can't bring himself to compete on Sunday, and that's when he's supposed to compete in the games. And then there's another character who's Jewish, Abrams, and he's reflecting on what he's doing from a very different perspective. But both stories, they're parallel, and they serve as points of contrast. But also there are kind of peripheral characters as well, and really kind of at the heart of this are many of these themes that you've been talking about, Tom.
One of them, in fact, when Little's race is on Sunday, one of them Little gets the race he was supposed to run because he says, hey, I've already got my gold. He can run mine.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, right.
That's not an attitude you would run into today.
Yeah.
Now, by the way, I would want to pull this back to the Middle Ages for a moment. There was a very popular game, which is the ancestor of football and soccer and stuff, that actually was used in the Roman Empire. The Roman soldiers did this to sort of toughen them up. There were basically two rules in the game. One of them is how you actually score points, and the other is murder is not allowed.
Well, good rule.
Yeah, but there were frequent fatalities in that game. Yeah. So if you think modern football, American football, is violent, consider this is really the kinder and gentler version of that.
Yeah.
Well, another film I'm thinking it comes to mind. You helped bring it to mind here, Glenn. Is the first Rollerball. I don't know if you guys remember Rollerball.
I remember it. Oh yeah.
Caan. Not the remake. The remake I didn't see, and people who saw it tell me it's terrible.
One I saw in the 70s. I was
yeah, it was it was James Caan, one of the guys in The Godfather. He plays Sonny in Godfather. But anyway. It's about the future and the return of blood sport.
Yeah.
Rollerball is a kind of gladiatorial contest, but I won't give it away. All you need to do is look it up. But one of the things that's interesting about it is that it envisions a world without nation states and sort of corporate interests take over the world. And so there's a kind of interesting sort of social, sort of kind of civic critique that's going on.
That's
And sort of it sees big business as actually a threat to the nation
Well,
state.
that's where that I'm going in that direction. But before I do, I think even you could say that some of the stuff going on with the Hunger Game films is about this return of this sort of elite watching this kind of game that everyone is involved in. It really connects the way in which everybody's playing and the way how significant it is for keeping those kind of hierarchies going, but satiating a certain kind of series of different kinds of needs. And this is the thing. I think, sociologists and Christians who kind of looked at it through kind of culture war lens, like Hunter and, those figures, they're aware of the symbolic character and war and battle going on, that this is always the case, that, to take Durkheim, these kind of religious symbols, that's what they functionally, they are the means by which a people become conscious of themselves, but continue to promote that kind of consciousness, right? So what do you start to get that has often now been adopted by the big corporations? So let's take Super Bowl. It is filled and flooded with corporate money interests, right? And besides that, they've now wed themselves to not only immense amounts of marketing and stuff to play into our passions and desires as cultural people, but they've really connected with the entertainment world. This is where the popular culture comes in. And they begin to basically reiterate the kind of values that, certain figures, corporations and the like want to promote because it's to their advantage. And it plays into something where the culture is already disposed, especially in its movement away from Christian formation towards really the God. You could say, the return of the goddess. Or how about just say narcissist, right? The self at the center of all things. So what do you get? Well, you get predominantly entertainments that are all about promoting an image of themselves, and that you can be like, myself too, if you basically act like me, listen to my music, follow me around, are influenced by me, whatever it is. But then the symbolic figures, right, you have now, because kind of woke is in, and it's all about kind of the diversity and multicultural, and those per se are not bad things. But when it becomes an ideology to satiate a kind of liberal consciousness, rather than actually something to do with actually valuing someone all the way down, you get this superficial pop culture version of what should be richer and deeper. But you get, all these performances catering to different people, reaffirming certain kinds of things in people so that they can continue basically to see themselves and be affected by those things. Look at the big Taylor Swift and this football player. First of all, it's bringing a lot of energy to the football world, but it's wedding that whole kind of teen pop culture to this drama event and orienting their appetites and loves into this kind of staged relationship. And they're bringing all of those kinds of pop elements into this sport. So this sport is becoming sort of spectator-like, and it is providing a lot of corporate and cultural benefit to a certain cultural disposition, if you will. And it is usually sold on this kind of self-expressive, empowered self, whether it's my glory as a great football player or it's my fame as a superficial singer that has just been promoted oftentimes beyond their talent, right? Whatever it is. Some of them are talents. I'm not trying to be harsh. But what I'm trying to say is, what is the bringing of all of these symbolic worlds into this one event trying to achieve? And what is it that we as Christians should be aware of, as Augustine was with the different things going on and Tertullian was? Not where we're just saying, don't do this or watch this or listen to it, but that it isn't theologically and spiritually innocent, and that there are evocations allurements that are happening, whether through marketing or the various ways in which all of these things are being presented, that are doing things to us as citizens and as Christians. And I think on one end, when you talk about pop culture, a lot of Christians have tried to mimic it in their churches, but they've been flooded with the same kind of conception of the human being that is flooded with all of popular culture, that is antithetical to a lot of Christian understanding, and actually is part of the self that needs to be denied, right? And now we just express it. Being a Christian is all about my self-expression and singing my, finding my voice. So I think we've been impacted. We are impacted. I'm not saying these things haven't been defanged from the old gods, but there is definitely a return with the self at the center that we can't ignore. So, any takes?
Well, another dimension to this, which maybe we don't want to go off on, is the legalization of sports gambling. So that now you have this constant drumbeat. If you're watching any sports games, you get these advertisements, especially football, I guess. You get these advertisements for sports betting, fantasy football leagues or whatever. Number one, gambling addiction is real. And this is just, and it actually works the same way as pushers on the street. You offer a big premium for your first bet, and then hopefully you'll get hooked and keep betting. It's just like your first hit is free.
Right.
But I think it was Orwell said something to the effect that the government didn't have to worry too much about the people because they had football, drinking, and especially gambling.
Yeah. Well, I think that brings up something I think worth considering. Essentially, powerful alternatives are strongly denounced. So obviously, the Christian faith in its true form is not welcome. In the stadium, it's not welcome. When it comes to the players and what they have to say after a game, the ones who are believers, it's not welcome. It's the natural family is not welcome. The natural family has a power that's rooted in the created order, and it evokes sentiments that can't be reconciled to any of this stuff. So therefore, it has to be, if not, denounced, at least ignored, or put on the same level with things that are clearly not on its level. So even national, patriotism. I think one of the things that's a dimension to sort of the patriotic sort of character of our elites has to do with their global aspiration, their global agenda. For example, you just think about Google. I mean, it's a global company, and if it doesn't want to alienate its Chinese audience, its Indian audience, or anything like that. Too much Americanism will do that. But this is a part of the story. I don't think it's the whole story, but I think it's part of the story for why there's such an embarrassment on the part of our cultured elites when it comes to things like the Pledge of Allegiance, and why they're willing to put up with conspicuous displays of disloyalty to the country.
Yeah. Well, that was one of the things that a popularization of, the kind of woke agenda now filtering its way through sports, which, if you think very hard about how ridiculous all of that is, where here you have a bunch of people who, are, a lot of them are great athletes, but making these incomes that no one else will ever see in their life, and yet moaning and groaning about how oppressive everyone else is. It is like Paul Griffith's article, these woke are not real really serious about their quote unquote socialism or communism. They're as committed to corporate culture. They just want to be the ones benefiting from it because some of them didn't have the ability to succeed in it in other ways. And sometimes the door was shut to certain people. Fine. But here you have, I think they had to change the narrative. That's why they have this kind of, a new popular something is now dominating, the sport to get everybody watching again. But interesting, and this could be done with any sport or any kind of thing culturally. I'm just using it because it just came up, and I'm not criticizing again people who just love and value doing well at a sport and committed to it, or love a team and stuff. I'm talking about all the stuff going on, all the stuff going on around it, right? And all of the stuff.
I even think those other things have compromised the sports.
Yeah.
So, for example, when you have the kind of money that has been invested in certain players, do you really want everybody to play as hard as they can, or do you create a kind of cushion around certain players in order to not harm the brand of the larger product? Which is the NFL in this instance, or you could talk about any other game. I think that the thing I've observed is often, and this is fascinating to consider, retired athletes, who succeeded in earlier eras are some of the harshest critics of the current state of the sports that they once participated in. This is particularly true in basketball, where the guys are just like, this stuff that's passing for basketball today at the professional level is just so bad that it's hard to even compare it to the era that I was in, that kind of thing. And that sounds like, the good old days talk. But when you look at the actual games footage and you say, well, it really was a tougher sport once, that kind of thing.
Yeah. And, it's interesting because in terms of, exactly that, the kind of the things required to play well and the kinds of, Augustine would even look in Roman society at people who limited their passions to do well, maybe for the wrong end of glory and not meritorious in any way, but still noble enough, something of God's providence that allows a people or a nation or a person to do something great, even if it's limited and distorted. And so you would have that in many ways with people who excel at any sport and love it. But on the other hand, it can become an instrument of a lot of the vices that really undermine themselves and their relationships and the larger culture. And you see this, I think, in this strong emphasis on being proud about yourself all the time. And this would be an area of critique that it isn't all about you. It isn't all about the endowments you have. They're gifts anyway. You've done something with them. That's great. But it's something in humility to receive and excel at and take joy in. You don't have to walk around like you're God's gift to the planet, right? Or, focus me. And then there's the flip side. You did see a little counter, and I didn't see it, but I heard some people who watched the game talked a commercial that came in that was supposed to be a kind of Christian opposition to all of that pride. And rightfully so. It was trying to emphasize humility in a way. So it shows Jesus washing the feet of all these sinners. It's a little commercial. But the problem was it was all the sinners that happened to be popular on the list of, the sentimental left and the sentimental, kind of liberal social conscience.
Yeah, what it really was a mockery of Christian conservatives.
Exactly. And it really was just liberal social, the appeal to liberal social conscience or some kind of innate human sympathy. But it isn't about the real humility that loves someone enough to tell them the truth that, you can find everything and you can find life and eternal happiness without yourself being the center of the stage. But death to yourself, which requires repentance, you can be transformed and made for eternity and a citizen of God's city. Mm-hmm. And I think really that sums up again what in our culture we're dealing with: different kinds of loves and different things loved differently. And the citizens of the kingdom can't be bound up with, even if they love in some way some of the things everyone else does, loving them the same way. They can't become idols, and they shouldn't be fostering the kinds of things that are fundamentally at odds with Christ and the riches we have in him.
Well, we got to that point where we should put a cherry on top when it comes to this show. Anything you want to? That was a great sort of kind of summary there at the end, Tom. But is there anything else you want to say?
I think that's enough. I've just been thinking about it. The occasion came up, and I'm reading about it going on in a lot of the early church fathers, and just trying to think through these things freshly.
Yeah. Anything maybe that occurred to you, Glenn, that you didn't have a chance to say?
Yeah, I've just been kind of pondering because of this. Okay, like I said, we don't want to go back to the fundamentalists to say don't do, all these do not do things. But I wonder sometimes if the backlash against that in evangelicalism hasn't left us too open to things we shouldn't really be open to.
Right.
So that's
that's
my reflection here.
Yeah, is it possible to have a discerning asceticism, or is that not possible? I guess that's the question I've got. It's almost like if you're going to have anything, you're going to have too much of certain aspects of it. You know what I'm getting at? Kind of the way it goes with just anything that we do as a sort of as a community, because you're going to have people that take any good thing in places that are kind of dumb.
If it's worth doing, it's worth doing to excess.
That's right. Anyway, well, thank you for listening to the Theology Pugcast. You've gotten to the end of this episode, and now it's time to talk about our big trip to the United Kingdom. We have set up an Indiegogo campaign, and it should be live by the time this show is live, and there's a link in the show notes to that. I won't talk a lot about it because the Indiegogo campaign does that for us. We just recorded a little piece for that just about an hour ago, and anyway, we're looking forward to being there. We've gotten people from the United Kingdom who've reached out to us and told us that they're looking forward to our arrival, and they're actually going to come out and spend some time with us, and we think that's great. But if you want to help kind of support the cause, go to the Indiegogo campaign and check it out. Anyway, we also are grateful to the folks who support us on Patreon on a regular basis, and we've had some recent gifts that have taken us into a new place when it comes to our monthly support, and we're grateful for that. There are costs that we incur on an ongoing basis, and the Patreon folks who support us regularly pay those bills. So thank you, folks, for doing that. Anyway, that's enough for now. Bye-bye.
Bye.
The Theology Pugcast is a ministry of Trinity Reformed Church in Huntsville, Alabama. To learn more about the church, you can visit trinityreformedkirk.com. trinityreformedkirk.com.